Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth of the Third Sector Digital Leader webinar series. Now, today we are looking at the future of digital, the future of work, and for that we're joined by Rhodri Davies, who is Head of Policy at CAF Online. Also hosts an excellent podcast called Giving Thought, which is well worth checking out if you're working in the sector. Before I hand over to my colleague Zoe, now Zoe, I've just noticed that you've hit mute, I think, on your microphone. Before I hand over to Zoe, just a couple of bits and pieces. There is the opportunity to ask questions, so use the chat box on the webinar. It's either on the bottom or the right-hand side of your screen. We'll read the questions out towards the end. Other than that, I think, Zoe, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. It gives me great pleasure to be chairing the fourth in the series of webinars that we're doing for the Third Sector Digital Leaders Programme. And we're very excited to be talking about a topic which comes up a lot on the programme itself, which is about what on earth does the future of my organisation look like? What will I be doing when I walk into my office in 10 years' time, and how will people be behaving differently? What tools will they be using? And above all, how can I start preparing for this stuff now? And I think we've got one of the best people in the sector, if not the best person, in fact, to help us explore these challenging issues, particularly in these volatile times. And that is Rhodri Davies, a Head of Policy at CAF, who, as you may know, as Dave mentioned, is not only runs an excellent podcast, but also is the author of some fantastic reports about what the future of the sector looks like. So Rhodri, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem. Thanks for having me. Do you want me to launch straight into my series of thoughts to get everything moving?
That would be great. Thank you, Rhodri.
Well, I'll try and keep it fairly brief so that we can kind of go into more of a conversation afterwards, and there'll be time for Q&A. But I was asked to give three thoughts kind of up front on, the future of work in charities and kind of what impact tech might have on that. And I guess without kind of delving into lots of detail, because I'll go down a rabbit hole then and be here for hours. I think the things that I wanted to say firstly are that when it comes to talking about technology, particularly sort of slightly more emergent or further ahead technology, I think it's a really good idea to try and get away from specific technologies and definitely sort of specific platforms or examples of those technologies, and think more about trends, because I think that's easier to apply from kind of other sectors to charities. And it also, I think, future-proofs things a bit much, because a lot of existing platforms and technologies might go by the wayside, but I think a lot of the bigger trends that we're seeing now will continue in one form or another. And then I think if you kind of manage to identify what some of those trends are, I think it's useful to think about the way in which they might affect your charity. And I broadly think there's kind of three ways which helps to frame the impact that it might have on how we're going to work in the future. The first is that it could provide really exciting new ways to deliver on your mission. So the whole kind of tech for good idea. And there are some really great examples out there of all kinds of technologies, AI, blockchain, VR, other things, even more kind of wild and wacky, that are already being, used or experimented with to deliver social and environmental goals. But then I think there's a whole basket of things which are more about the wider impact on the operating environment. So the way tech will affect kind of the way that we communicate and interact, the way that money works, the way that quite boring things like accountancy and reporting work, which actually will affect organizations and individuals of all kinds, including those who work in charities. And then I think the final one that is quite important is thinking about some of the negative implications of technology that we're starting to be aware of now, kind of the way in which, for instance, automated processes and algorithms, for instance, can start to show bias. Well, that kind of thing, I think, will affect the nature of the kinds of problems that all of us working in the charity sector are going to be working on, and will probably affect the kinds of roles we're doing and the sort of skills that we'll need. So I think, the question working back from all of those possible futures is going to be, what do we need to do now in terms of skills development and leadership to make sure that we're well positioned for that future, which hopefully tees us up for a conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Rhodri. So with that in mind, what do you see as the biggest trends that charity leaders need to know about there? So we've touched on some of them already, but it would be great to hear more about your thoughts on those trends.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and sort of skirt over these in not too much detail, but if anybody wants me to kind of, explain a bit more about what I mean, I'm happy to do that after. I mean, I think there's a few that I generally try to identify. One is around kind of two-hander around decentralization and disintermediation, which are two overly long words, but basically it means kind of getting rid of traditional middlemen or middle people, and kind of putting people who have assets or kind of produce content more directly into contact with those who want it. So we sort of see this in the commercial sphere with the rise of platforms in transport, you've got Uber. In property, you've got Airbnb. When it comes to media, you've got YouTube, Netflix, and others. And the business model there is much more about kind of connecting people who produce things with people who want them, rather than sort of feeling you as an organization have to produce it all yourself. And I think that will end up being quite relevant for charities. We've already seen quite a lot of models that are trying to enable people to do similar things with charities. So kind of you've got global giving, you've got people like Give Directly in the US trying to allow people to do sort of direct cash transfers. Kiva's doing a similar thing for loans. And I think, interestingly, we're seeing a similar trend emerge in kind of wider social campaigning. So, I think it's really interesting that a lot of the big high-profile campaigns of recent years, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the Grenfell Tower response over here, none of them are really sort of traditional charity-led campaigns. They're all much looser, networked-based social movements, and I think that's going to be a really big trend for the future. A separate thing, I think, without going into detail, data. I think I'll just say data, but how we kind of collect data, what the ownership model is, what the quality of it is, whether it's open, how we make it transparent. All of these sorts of questions are going to be massive ones for all of us in the future. I think then there's a question about what you do with that data, and obviously that brings you on to kind of automation and AI. I think around that, we're already well aware in lots of other walks of our life about our increasing reliance on kind of recommendations when we go to look for things. So, Netflix tells us what films to watch. Spotify tells me what music to listen to, which is mostly music from the early 90s, it turns out, because I'm drowning in nostalgia.
You're not alone, don't worry.
No, I know I'm not. But I think, the same thing, there's going to reach a point where it's going to be odd not to have the same sort of functionality when it comes to charitable giving. So we're going to sort of expect to be given recommendations and tailored advice on charity from the sort of platforms and interfaces that we're working with. And that will potentially be a massive shift. A lot of charities already struggle with SEO and sort of search engine optimization. What's it going to look like when we've all got to optimize for algorithms that we barely understand, and even the people who wrote them probably don't understand? So I think there are some interesting questions there. And then I think one more, I think, sort of building on that, is the way in which we access information is also going to change a lot. I think we've already started to see the emergence of voice-controlled interfaces, sort of moving away from the screen-based model. I think we'll see more of that, and it'll become more naturally integrated as we have things like heads-up screen reading technology and things that look like Google Glasses but not stupid. And also, I think as the internet comes to be embedded more in objects around us, I think that you'll in the future you'll sort of move and operate in buildings where you don't need to go to a screen or a dedicated terminal to access the internet. It'll just sort of be there in an ambient sense all around you. And actually, in terms of our expectations and the way we seek out information, I can barely get my head around it, but it's going to have some really quite profound implications, I think, for how we do that.
Wow, thank you, Rhodri. There's a very helpful summary there. Which of those trends do you think are going to translate into something really transformative, and which are the ones that at this stage you think they might be hype? I mean, for example, I know we've talked a lot about blockchain, and we've talked about the workplace of the future looking almost like something of a science fiction film, which of course it could do. But what's your gut feel at the moment for what's really going to take off over the next 5 years, and what isn't going to, really turn out to be true?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was saying about trying to focus less on specific technologies and more on the trends. I think you're right. I mean, something like blockchain, I've done a lot of work in that area. I still think there's something very interesting. I was at a meeting in New York last week about blockchain, and there were lots of people there genuinely doing stuff, and I was really encouraged to be reminded that that is happening. But it's definitely been through a big hype cycle, and probably sort of started to go back down the other side of that peak of hype. I think in terms of thinking about those trends, the other thing to bear in mind is that kind of piece of wisdom from the tech sector, Amara's law, which is, I think Guy Roy Amara, who is a futurist, said, we tend to overestimate the impact of tech in the short term, but then underestimate it in the long term. And I think that's right. Sometimes in the sort of heat and noise of the here and now, it's very easy to get carried away, and then you get cynical, and then you sort of assume that all of the impact of this tech is massively overblown. But actually, I think it's important to keep taking a step back. I mean, I think in terms of that, some of those trends that I outlined up front about things like decentralization and automation and, changes to the way that we interact with information, I kind of frame them in those terms because I think at that level, I'm sure that they are going to happen. I don't know which actual technology it will rely on. I don't know what the platforms will look like. I don't really know what the timescale is. But as soon as we know that we can do those things, I can't really see the people putting the genie back in the bottle and saying, "Oh, actually, do you know what? Let's not bother." Somebody will go ahead and make them happen. So that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, the train has left the station already, hasn't it, for a lot of this new technology? So speaking of that, let's imagine it's 2029 and you're walking into the charity workplace of the future. What are people doing, and what does it look like, and how are they behaving differently?
Yeah, I like this question. I was reminded in preparing for this, I looked up, there's a brilliant essay that Isaac Asimov did for the 1954 World's Fair, where he imagined the world of 2014. And, he was a very smart man and a very good writer, but a lot of it looks very, very silly in hindsight. And I think I'm probably in danger of the same thing here. I mean, that being said, I think, one of the things I think is you walk into the charity workplace of the future and there might not be anybody there. I mean, I genuinely think that the direction of travel at the moment is that, as the technology becomes more affordable and genuinely enables things like this to happen, where we can all be sitting in different places and seamlessly interact, why would you go to the expense of having a kind of centralized office space for people to be in and to kind of tie your hands when it comes to recruitment and people's location? Actually, I think more and more people will work remotely. And I guess, my experience of doing that for a little while at the moment is you tend then to focus the time that you're actually in a specific place on face-to-face meetings and interactions. So you do all of your admin and your research on the train or at home. And then when you're in the office, actually you focus on that. So maybe the office becomes, less of a sort of hideous open plan affair and more of a place that's designed to kind of promote social interaction. I think more broadly, people will kind of, that's how it'll work in terms of the office space. The other thing, I think is very likely to happen is that there will become much more of a sense of people not working in one specific job or for one particular organization, but working increasingly on a kind of a range of different projects at different times, some of which will be kind of paid for, some of which will be voluntary or might be kind of rewarded in different ways, using kind of social incentives or something. Like people work on open source projects and things at the moment. And actually lots of people will end up having a kind of portfolio of all of these different things. I think that will have potentially quite a sort of big impact on the way in which charities and other organizations think about how they package up what they do. Because actually, to appeal to people, you can't just say, here is your job and this is your functional role. You'll have to create projects that allow people to bring a much broader range of skills and experience to bear. The other thing, I think, in terms of types of jobs where we are working, I think there's going to be all kinds of jobs that we can barely imagine at the moment. I mean, taking the whole question that we were talking about before about sort of automation and the impact of AI, one of the things that I think we will see is more focus within the sector on data ethics and kind of how we train algorithms. So I think there will be job titles like algorithm trainer, data ethicist, that kind of thing. Because actually, these things will be used elsewhere. They will also be used within the charity sector. And, the best way of achieving a charitable mission in the future might well be to make sure that data is used responsibly, and you will need the skills to do that.
Wow, yeah, absolutely. So it could look like a very different thing, couldn't it? The charity workplace of the future. Because I guess especially when I think about the larger organisations, even if you've got a lot of digital expertise in-house, the model itself can feel quite analog. I think we've talked about this before. You have a big central London office and teams of staff who are all on the payroll. So yeah, absolutely, the model could change quite significantly, and the experience that we offer employees and volunteers as well. Brilliant. So how can we all start preparing for this then, Rhodri? I mean, it sounds as if it's simultaneously so far, but yet so very near as well, this kind of brave new world. So what could we all do to start preparing for it now?
Well, that's the sort of $64,000 question. And if I had the perfect answer to it, I'm sure I'd be a much wealthier person than I am. I mean, I guess, what I'm trying to do in a lot of the work that I do about tech is yes, to think through what some of those future implications might be and the things that are sort of slightly further down the track, but then also, where possible, to kind of work back from that to, okay, what does that mean right here and now in terms of what organizations should be doing to educate themselves, how they should be thinking about, development and HR and that kind of thing. I guess the first thing to say on that education front is there just needs to be loads more of that. I think, if people buy the argument that tech is no longer something that's just happening over there, but is going to cut across all of our lives and, the way that charities operate, then we just need to get a lot better about being more aware of what some of those trends are and doing more work to kind of translate it to the charity context. There are people doing it already. I think we probably need to sort of pull a lot of that together, and kind of infrastructure bodies and others play a role in convening and coordinating a lot of that information. I think there's definitely something to be said about kind of making sure that you've got skills within the organization. And I think, that's at senior management, leadership level, and trustees, which is, I know, something that you've spoken a lot about, Zoe. And I guess, my plea there in a way would be, particularly when it comes to emerging tech, I don't think the assumption should be that in order to engage on these issues, you have to be a machine learning expert or to have delved into the depths of blockchain. Actually, that's unlikely to be the case, because a lot of those sorts of people, in all honesty, are going to be difficult to bring into the sector, because there's a kind of arms race on, really, particularly around something like machine learning. But it's more about having the sort of intellectual curiosity and open-mindedness to kind of engage with them sufficiently to understand what they are and kind of how they relate to your actual day job, and then leave the rest of the detail behind. And actually, there's probably an argument that the people in the charity sector can play a really valuable role more broadly within technology, precisely because they aren't coders or developers or come from that background. And actually, if they're bringing a broader range of diverse viewpoints and kind of lived experience, that's genuinely of value to the tech sector, if it means what it says about developing some of these technologies more ethically. And then I think the final thing I'd say in terms of kind of what you can do in the here and now, I always think there must be, huge pockets of untapped experience and skills within the charity sector of people whose job isn't necessarily digital or tech, or who are at a reasonably junior level at the moment, but are, for them, this stuff is second nature, and they're not currently finding opportunities to bring that to bear in their day job. So actually, ways in which that could be made more possible are of real interest. And I was just reading something a little while ago, the idea of having kind of internal task boards or sort of job boards or project boards within an organization where you pitch something in very sort of specific terms, and then people, regardless of what their job title or function is, are able to kind of contribute skills to it. And that kind of brings those sorts of hidden skills out of the woodwork. I think things like that are really interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So almost like an Amazon model where you kind of define a problem and then you bring a cross-functional team together to work on it, regardless of what you're kind of working on. It's almost like that Google thing as well, isn't it? Where you get a certain allocation of your time as an employee to work on whatever projects interest you alongside your more formal roles and responsibilities. So speaking of that, what do you think all of this means for the way in which we actually recruit and develop leaders' skills in particular? Because they've got a hell of a job on their hands, haven't they, to get to grips with, the long-term implications of automation and data and all the ethical issues and how they sort of manage these emerging technologies being brought into their charities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it goes to a couple of things that I was saying before, but definitely applies when we're talking about getting leaders on board. I mean, one I suppose is, if we're thinking about getting more digital or tech leaders into the sector, unpacking a bit what that actually means, because I think there's a sort of assumption that it means you have to be able to code in Python or something, and I'm not sure that should be a baseline requirement, or even that it's actually very useful. I think it's actually being sort of clearer about, at a strategic level, about what it means to be a digital leader in the charity sector, and also not devaluing the charity half of that equation, because I think sometimes when people from the charity world engage on these sort of wider digital issues, it comes across as a bit apologetic. It's almost like, we've engaged on the sort of tech bit, but sorry, we're definitely at a disadvantage here, and that's understandable when you're in a room with Google or Facebook or that sort of thing. The power dynamic is a bit odd. But then if we're actually talking about using this stuff for social good and genuinely using it to address real world problems, the people who actually understand that are the charities. And I think they should be more forward about kind of that part of their experience and the fact that that is valuable. So I think, actually kind of being a charity leader in the digital sphere is something that could really be quite powerful in the future. I think also, we've talked more broadly about the question of how you think about HR and the workplace and kind of the things you can offer. I think when it comes to attracting and retaining people with tech skills, or the sorts of people that you would want to be sort of leaders in that new digital context, frankly, probably charities are always going to struggle if it just ends up being about salary. And to be honest, in the future, they're probably going to struggle if it comes down to just talking about purpose, because there's, in the public sector and the private sector, there's lots of organizations telling you that you can have a job with purpose. So we really have to think about what it is that we can offer above and beyond that, in terms of, the kind of the flexibility of the workplace, the work-life balance, the way in which it fits with family life, and all those sorts of things, so that people can make a choice about working in the charity sector and bringing those skills to bear, rather than going off and making a mint working for Facebook.
And I think that's such a good point, because I was listening to Bruce Daisley's Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat podcast. I'm completely nerdy about that podcast, and I think that's such a great insight into how the workplace is changing. And one of the things that he's saying the other week, which I think is very much related to what you were just saying, is that we need to look at HR really differently, and should it even be one department? So he talked about how there's obviously one side of HR which is very much about the transaction and everyone getting paid and all those sorts of things, and then there's the other side of it, which is obviously about the organizational change and how we attract people to work for charities, and what that kind of package that we offer them really looks looks like. So perhaps that's also something we need to think through as leaders, actually, as much as whether we're going to be using robots in the workplace of the future, which I'm sure we are.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, actually, when it comes to that whole question of working backwards from the here and now to work out how to position ourselves to sort of take advantage of some of those technological opportunities, actually, a lot of the time it does end up being much more about quite pragmatic things to do with, HR and payroll and these sorts of things, and the kind of legal side of stuff. So actually, I think joining up, a lot of the work that's happening, I know that you're working on around things like ensuring charities have digital skills for the world as it is now, with some of the more forward-looking stuff about how the world might be, I think is absolutely vital.
Great, thank you very much, Rhodri. That was such an insightful discussion, and I'd like to open this more widely now. So now is the time. We've got about 20 minutes left for people to grill Rhodri, ask his questions. So if you have a question now, please do type it into the chat box and let us know, and then we'll read them out.
Rhodri, just to kick things off, I really liked your point about following trends rather than sort of platforms. I think there's a danger that you can become a bit like a magpie and just always going after the bright, shiny new thing. I don't know if you remember Ello. I mean, Ello a couple of years ago, that was a very exciting 24 hours for everyone, and then it went anywhere. But just sort of tips, where can people, what's available for people to stay on top of the trends, and what should they be looking out for?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that people do ask me quite a bit. And I should say up front that I'm not, sort of party to any privileged information, and I'm no more informed than lots of people. I'm curious about this stuff, and I read around a lot. I mean, I would say there's some good sort of news resources specifically focused on tech stuff. Like I find Futurism, the website Futurism's good, Ars Technica's good, Mashable. Those sorts of websites. It's not charity specific, but I think usually, if you are aware of those things and you can kind of think laterally a bit, actually you can read across without too much difficulty. Similarly, it's worth going to places like, the big consultancies and audit firms, Deloitte and PwC and McKinsey and people like that, because they're obviously getting paid a lot of money to think about this sort of thing. And again, what they're talking about usually isn't about charities, but where it is about the operating environment or the impact on organizations or the workplace. Well, charities are organizations that have staff and workplaces, so you can usually read some of that stuff across. I think when it comes to more specific kind of charity sector or civil society stuff, I mean, obviously go and read the Giving Thought pages at the CAF website. There's quite a lot of stuff around digital civil society in the US particularly. And I find, over here in the UK, Charity Digital News does a lot of good work kind of pulling together stories there, some of which are more kind of here and now and some of which are sort of future looking. I'd also say, as well as those kind of news resources, I think it's really worth stepping back and reading books. I'm a massive advocate for books as a kind of slightly more, as the value of having taken a step back and not feeling like they have to rush and doing a completed thought. And whilst there's a danger when you're talking about technology that things can go out of date very quickly, if people are writing a book, usually they pull it back to a level where they are talking about much bigger trends, or they're kind of taking into account history. And I think it's quite helpful in terms of that whole point about making sure you don't get carried away and you're actually thinking about things at a slightly bigger picture level.
Okay, great.
Are there any books that you particularly recommend, Rhodri?
Ooh, books there's so books that I really like. Have to be careful. So what ones I've read recently, I thought there was a book called Machines of Loving Grace that I read, which is about the sort of history of AI and takes you through quite a lot of the big characters in the development of it at the moment. But it's a really good kind of backdrop to some of the issues there. If you're interested in the kind of the impact of tech on sort of civil society and social movements, there's a great book called Twitter and Tear Gas by Zeynep Tufekci, which is really, really interesting. If you want thinking, I have some issues with it, but I think you will know Harari's stuff in Homo Deus is really interesting. If you like a historical perspective, there's a brilliant book called Turing's Cathedral, which is all about the history of kind of digital computing. And again, you have to be quite interested in the tech itself to get a lot out of it. And I happen to be interested in the tech, but also interested in civil society stuff. So you kind of got to pick and choose a bit, because if you just want to read about the sort of charity specific bits, you're probably better sticking to news sources where somebody's done the work of translating. Whereas if you're kind of much more broadly interested in futurism and tech, maybe you've kind of got more of an appetite for that sort of thing.
Excellent. Thank you, Rhodri. All good ones to add to my Amazon wish list. So the questions are coming in now. I've got some really good ones. So before I come to those, just on books, Pauline Roche has actually recommended a couple of books here by Beth Cantor, The Network Nonprofit and Measuring the Network Nonprofit as well. So also good ones to ask for Christmas.
I'd second both of those recommendations. Yeah.
Brilliant. So let's take the questions. So Volker's got a great question here. What could charities do to lead in the developments to avoid being left behind?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think there are, in some of the things we're talking about, it does seem as though, I've been perhaps slightly negative about charities' chances of even keeping pace. And I think in some areas where it's reliant on having huge amounts of financial resources or huge amounts of technical expertise, they are going to struggle. But I guess the trick then is to think about places in which they could take a lead. I mean, one, for example, I think around that question of data. So, data is a massive resource at the moment. It's kind of the thing that makes machine learning possible. It's the thing that makes all of the valuation of companies like Facebook and Google so enormous. But we're increasingly aware that the bargain that we've struck, where we sort of give away personal data for free in order to get all of these products and services, we're not that comfortable with, because sometimes that data is used in ways that we're not very happy about or might get lost and all these sorts of things. So actually there's a lot of talk about how do we rebalance that relationship, get a better kind of ethical approach to data. Well, that strikes me as one place where charities, if they got their own house in order around data, should not just seek to kind of do as well as the corporate or public sector, but do even better and kind of model best practice and show what a genuinely ethical approach to data might look like. And actually, the optimist in me thinks if they did that, maybe others would follow suit. I think, a similar thing in terms of things like being very forward thinking about working practices. Again, if that's more just about flexibility and kind of cultural mindset rather than vast amounts of money, then it might be open to charities to steal a march there on other sectors. So I think there are places where they could, but they need to sort of focus on the ones that don't require, unreasonable things like vast amounts of money or skills.
Yeah, and maybe talking to your employees or even your candidates about what their expectations are of the technology they might be using or wanting to use as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both to see what they want to get out of it, what their existing experience is, and also, going to that thing of trying to tap into pockets of expertise. I mean, if people are coming to work for an organization in a particular role, but have all of this, they spend their spare time doing kind of open source coding or whatever, and are never called upon to do that in their job. It seems to me like a slight, an unfortunate thing.
That's a very good point. Very good point. So there's a really good question here from Claudia. With people living and working longer, I think digital is a good area to think about in terms of how you can retrain into new areas as part of making a next job move. So I think she'd love to hear your recommendations about how non-tech charity people can take a step towards a tech role.
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think probably one where I'm not sure we've kind of cracked the nut yet. I do genuinely, I subscribe to the view that thinking that engaging with sort of tech or digital is all about having a very specific set of skills, or having to feel like you've got to go away and do, a big online course on coding. I'm not sure that's really the case. I think, if you want to do that, great. But I think there are increasingly roles within the sector and beyond it. All of them will have an element of tech. I mean, I guess if you think about it, like very few of us have a job where we don't have to use at least email or kind of search or, you know, spreadsheets or whatever. But most of us don't think of ourselves as technologists or even, you know, digital workers. And actually on top of that, if you then start using, you know, digital tools like Slack or whatever in the workplace, or you're doing things like podcasting or producing video content, actually there's a sort of slow creep where a lot of what you do is digital, even if you didn't necessarily think it was. So, I mean, I think to some extent trying to get away from the idea that there are digital jobs or kind of tech jobs, and actually people feeling confident that, you know, the skills they already have, they could just kind of add a little bit of digital on top of that, or just kind of get sufficiently up to speed with tech to understand how all of that existing expertise is really relevant. I mean, from the point of view of employers, I do think it makes that case that actually thinking about ongoing learning and development is going to be vital, because the chances that any of us now are going to be doing the same job by the time we finish our careers that we are, or that we started doing, it seems very small to me.
I think that's right. I mean, maybe one thing you could do, Georgia, you know, building on that excellent advice, is to go to your employer and kind of make the case for what your job could look like in 5 years' time, and then see what support they can offer you to make that happen. So that could be sending you on courses, but as Rhodri says, it might also be things like, you know, books and talking to people from other organisations who are a couple of steps ahead. So that might be another way to tackle it, as well as doing those excellent things that Rhodri recommends.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, I'm on here. I'm on a webinar with you, Zoe, and I think actually I should be throwing back the question to you, because you know a lot more than I do about the actual practical reality of upskilling people around digital now. So I definitely defer to you on that.
I don't think that's necessarily the case, but thank you. Oh, and Claudia's put a really good point here about how, you know, that multi-stage approach to life is so important. I mean, I was at a conference yesterday talking about how the average career is going to be, you know, 60, 70 years, you know, with life expectancy increasing. I mean, do you think charities are prepared for that yet, Rhodri? Are they sort of thinking about digital skills and what the charity of the future could look like in that context?
Again, you've done probably more research and engagement with. I mean, my sense is probably no, and that's not supposed to be a sort of stick to beat charities with. I mean, the challenge with all of this stuff, I know, is that even if you're working at a charity or leading a charity and you're looking at this and saying, I definitely agree, you know, tech is going to be a huge shaping factor. We all need to develop the skills that we need for the future and all that sort of stuff. The actual day-to-day reality of having to fundraise and kind of keep the lights on does make it very difficult to do that strategic thinking and kind of plan for the future. So, you know, I don't mean to kind of denigrate charities for that. I suspect, you know, there is a lot more to be done to get organizations to think in these terms, and to think about kind of their responsibilities to their workforce and kind of how they help them to develop ongoing skills, and also kind of whether the whole environment will fundamentally change so that the organization needs to operate in a totally different way. Because, you know, if people do start to shift more towards portfolio careers and project-based stuff and don't even want to have jobs with one particular organization, if you are a sort of traditional charity, do you want to tap into that and try and present opportunities for those sorts of people to work on that new basis? Or do you just kind of work with the dwindling pool of people who do still want that kind of job? I mean, I know which one I would prefer to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's a big question for trustees to grapple with, isn't it? When effectively some of them might have kind of come into the workplace in a different time. Excellent. So I think we've got about 5 minutes left. But if you've got any final questions, please do add them into the box. Whilst we're waiting for that, Dave, is there anything that you would like to ask?
Yeah, Rhodri, just coming back to blockchain, because you don't have to spend much time reading about future technology before you do come across blockchain. And I was just wondering if, firstly, you could just give us sort of a definition of what blockchain is and what it does, and then perhaps some potential ways that it could be used by the charity sector in the future?
Yeah, I'll give you the
question
I'll
with
give you
5 minutes to go.
That's fine. I'll give you the 5-minute version rather than. It's fine. I mean, yeah, blockchain it's more difficult than something like virtual reality or AI to explain, because it's slightly less kind of, visceral and obvious what it does. The simplest possible version of it is basically a way of keeping records of ownership and transactions in a system, but without having to have a kind of traditional middleman like you used to. So the old model is you would have somebody in the middle maintaining a ledger, whether that's a government, whether it's a law firm, whether it's a charity, whether it's the Charity Commission. But the way in which blockchain works means that you can keep that record, but the responsibility for updating it and making sure it's secure is spread across everybody in the system. So you don't need to have somebody in the middle. That's the very, very short version. The kind of interesting features of it that come out of that, one is about transparency. So items that you put on a blockchain are they're transparent, but in a fairly radical way. So for instance, money, either in the form of a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or a sort of token, separate digital object that you put on the blockchain, can be uniquely tracked all the way through a system. And in the charity context, what this would mean is it opens up the possibility that you could, if you make a donation on one of these blockchain platforms, you can uniquely trace your donation all the way through the charity and right out the other side to whoever receives it. So, at the moment, I give my money to a big aid organization or charity. Even if they tell me that a certain percentage goes on X, Y, or Z, my actual money is mixed into a big pot with everybody else's money, and I don't know where it goes. If I do it on the blockchain, I literally can see my money, and I can see whether it gets spent on mosquito nets or biscuits for an internal meeting. Now, that potentially brings some really big upsides in terms of trust and transparency. As you can probably see from the example I gave about biscuits, it presents some challenges around existing problems with kind of explaining spending on core costs, and getting people to sort of understand exactly why charities need to spend on certain things. The other thing, I mean, there's a few different things blockchain can do, but the other one that I think is really interesting is it's sort of a decentralizing technology. So, get rid of those traditional middlemen. That works at the level of a system or a market. So you kind of strip out layers within a sort of chain of aid agencies or something like that. But it also works at the level of an individual organization. So you can use it to kind of do a lot of the things that currently require you to have a centralized hierarchical organization like a charity or a company. But instead you can just do it as a loose network and then bind everybody together using the technology. So it actually might sort of supercharge some of those network examples that we've already got out there. That's all right. Hello. Network social movements or kind of, open source movements, which are very powerful already, but have some limitations in terms of scale and coordination. Blockchain as a technology has the potential, not proven yet, but has the potential maybe to take that even further.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rhodri.
Thank you.
No problem.
Great.
I can see it's definitely school picking up time, so it's probably going to be the same for me in a minute.
Absolutely. So on that note, Rhodri, thank you so much for sharing your brilliant insights into how we can all prepare for what the future of the charity workplace looks like. Dave, is there anything that you wanted to add about? We've got the final webinar tomorrow, haven't we?
Yeah, so tomorrow morning, 10:30 to 11:15, we'll be joined by Tori Ellaway of CAST, and we're looking at user insights. So how charities can do user testing on a tight budget, the key things to bear in mind when doing user testing. Now, the link for that is on our website. So if you go to www.the-sse.org, and then if you click programs and workshops, there's a link there. And I'll also tweet a link out from the SSE Twitter account, which is @SCSOCENT, so the first three letters of School for Social Entrepreneurs. And we hope that you can join us tomorrow.
Great. Thank you so much, Rhodri, and thank you very much to everyone who's involved. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank
Bye
you.
now, everyone.
Cheers, Rhodri. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.